Every country on the planet carries debt, and none of them can shake it off. The United States sits on 38 trillion. Japan carries 9 trillion. Altogether, the world is buried under 315 trillion, a pile 3 times bigger than the entire global economy. And here's the part that should make you pause. If everyone owes money, who stands on the other side of the ledger? Most people imagine some massive creditor, some clear party collecting the bill. But that isn't how it works. When you follow the chain, when you look at who actually owns the claims, you find something unsettling. The world isn't paying an outside force. It's paying itself, locked in a loop that never resets. And this didn't happen by accident. Across 3 centuries, 4 bankers built the framework piece by piece. They shaped a structure where debt rolls forward forever, where governments keep borrowing because stopping would break everything, where interest always moves upward through the system, feeding the same small circles that designed it. These men didn't hide what they were doing. The meetings were real, the documents survived, and the mechanics sit out in the open if you bother to look. Once you grasp what they built, the 38 trillion the United States owes stops looking like a crisis. It looks like the machinery running as intended. To understand the trap, you have to look back at how rulers borrowed before 1694. Kings went to nobles or merchants, got a loan, promised to repay with interest, and hoped for the best. If they failed, they defaulted. Creditors took the hit, and the king found someone else willing to lend. It wasn't efficient, and it wasn't pretty, but it was limited. The debt ended one way or another. It was either cleared or written off. Nothing about it was permanent. Then William Paterson stepped in and flipped the logic. Paterson, a Scottish merchant with more failed schemes than successes, stumbled into the idea that would change how nations finance themselves. In 1691, England was struggling. The war with France drained everything. King William III needed cash, and fast. The treasury had nothing left. Taxes weren't keeping up, and the usual lenders wanted nothing to do with England since England had defaulted more than once. Paterson went to the king with a plan that sounded bold but simple. He said he could gather wealthy merchants willing to lend 1.2 million. Today, that's roughly 300 million, a giant amount for the time. But the twist made it different from any loan before it. The government wouldn't repay the principal at all. Instead, it would pay 8% interest every year permanently. And to make the whole thing work smoothly, Paterson pushed for a new institution, the Bank of England. The structure looked clean on paper. Merchants brought their gold and placed it in the Bank of England. The bank then lent that gold to the government. The government paid interest each year using tax revenue. The bank collected that money and passed it back to the merchants. But the key detail was that the original 1.2 million never came back. It stayed on the books forever. Why did merchants agree to this? Because Parliament guaranteed the interest. It wasn't a gamble on a king's goodwill. It was backed by the full force of the government's power to tax. For lenders, that meant steady income. For the government, it meant endless borrowing. And for the world, it marked the moment when debt stopped being temporary and became something permanent, something built into the structure of nations themselves. As long as England kept collecting taxes, the interest kept coming in. The lenders didn't lose anything because the notes they got for their gold moved around like regular cash. In some ways, those notes were even better than coins since they earned steady interest. In 1694, Parliament backed Paterson's plan, and that was the moment the Bank of England became official. The merchants put their gold on the table, the crown secured its money for the war, and something new appeared in the world: national debt that never really ended. It stopped being a temporary burden and turned into a built-in part of how the state worked. Most people never hear why this setup was such a win for the bankers.
The government agreed to pay 8% a year on £1.2 million. That meant £96,000 in interest every single year, without an end date. The merchants had basically purchased a lifetime income stream from the government. As long as England stayed alive and kept taxing its citizens, that income was guaranteed. And if any lender wanted out, they didn't wait for repayment. They simply sold their notes to someone else. The debt moved from hand to hand, but the principal itself never had to be returned. Paterson's smartest idea wasn't the loan. It was what followed. The Bank of England received the authority to issue its own notes backed by the government's debt. That meant the bank could print paper money equal to the value of the loan. New money appeared out of nothing more than the government's promise to pay. The IOU itself became currency. And every time the government borrowed again, even more money could be printed. This became the model everyone followed. Governments borrow, they don't repay the principal, they send interest year after year, and the debt transforms into a kind of money. Bankers loved it. Taxpayers ended up carrying the cost forever, since they funded the interest on a debt that would never go away. Within 50 years, the biggest powers in Europe copied the setup. France launched the Bone Général. The Netherlands, already strong in finance, made government debt a formal tool. And in 1790, the United States, newly independent and trying to stabilize itself, adopted the same structure. Alexander Hamilton, as mentioned earlier, shaped the American system around the Bank of England's design: permanent debt, taxes covering interest, and government bonds circulating in the market like cash. Paterson died in 1719. He wasn't especially rich, even though he created the institution that defined British finance. But the system he designed survived long after him. More than 3 centuries have passed, and the Bank of England is still part of the British state. The national debt has never been cleared. It's been reshaped, refinanced, and stretched, but not actually removed. The trap laid in 1694 stayed in place, and every government chose to use it. By the early 1800s, European rulers relied on debt for everything: wars, public works, and daily expenses. But the process was messy. Each loan required separate negotiation. Interest rates jumped from deal to deal, and only elite merchants could get involved. Nathan Rothschild changed the whole landscape. He took sovereign debt and turned it into a full-scale industry. The Rothschilds started out as small-scale traders and money handlers in Frankfurt, but by 1800, the 5 brothers had built major banking houses in London, Paris, Frankfurt, Vienna, and Naples. No one else had a network like that, and it let them shape government finance in a way no single family had ever done before. They had a way to push money across borders faster than anyone else, and that speed turned into power. It let them take over the business of sovereign debt. In London, Nathan Rothschild became the one who shaped the whole strategy. During the Napoleonic Wars, he helped Britain stay funded. But the trick wasn't the loans themselves, it was the structure he used. Instead of handing cash straight to the government, he bought government bonds at a discount, held them for a moment, and passed them on to investors at a higher price. That simple shift created a real market for those bonds. Britain needed funds right away, and he delivered. Then he offloaded the bonds to pension funds, insurance firms, and wealthy buyers who wanted something they could trade. The government got quick liquidity, Rothschild earned the difference, and investors ended up with an asset they could move whenever they wanted. But there was a darker side to how he operated. He didn't just supply governments with money. He arranged things so governments couldn't avoid dealing with him. In 1815, during the Battle of Waterloo, Nathan Rothschild got word of Napoleon's defeat before anyone else in London. His couriers beat the official messengers. That early news gave him an edge in the British bond market. He sold British bonds first, which made it look like Britain was losing. Prices dropped. Other traders panicked and dumped theirs too. When the market was bleeding out, he stepped back in and bought huge amounts at the lowest possible prices. The next day, when the official announcement of victory arrived, the same bonds shot upward. He made an enormous profit, not through what we'd label insider trading today, but through control of information and timing. This became the Rothschild pattern. Hold the news, hold the issuance, hold the market. By 1820, the family dominated sovereign borrowing across Europe. Any government that wanted a loan ended up talking to the Rothschilds because they controlled the investor pipelines. They knew who was buying, who was selling, and how to place a bond issue so it succeeded. They had reach, and they had the leverage that came with it. That's where the debt trap took shape. Before this system, if a monarch defaulted, creditors took the loss and the world moved on. Debt stayed mostly local. But once Rothschild made sovereign bonds easy to trade across borders, things changed. A British bond could sit with a French investor for a few months, move to a German bank, and later serve as collateral for an Austrian aristocrat's loan. Ownership turned into a tangled web stretching across countries. A default no longer hit just one lender. It threatened the entire network built on those bonds. The innovation wasn't just in selling debt, it was in making every part tied to every other part so tightly that default became unthinkable. Governments weren't paying because they were disciplined. They were paying because not paying meant blowing up a whole financial structure. And once trapped, they kept borrowing just to cover interest on earlier loans. The cycle didn't only become permanent, it turned into something they couldn't escape. By the mid-1800s, the Rothschild family reached its peak. They were wealthier than any royal house, and that wealth came from one stream: interest from sovereign debt. They didn't manufacture goods, they didn't construct infrastructure. They built a system where money itself did all the work for them. They kept lending to governments and taking interest without an end date. Patterson set this up in 1694, and by 1815, Rothschild pushed it to a scale no one had seen. Every major government in Europe got stuck in that model. By 1900, America was rising fast in industry and trade, but its financial system was still rough. Banks acted on their own. Money supply stayed chained to gold. There was no central body to handle debt or stabilize anything. J.P. Morgan stepped into that gap. He didn't do it for the public. He did it to guard his own banking network. In 1907, panic hit. Markets plunged, banks collapsed, and business activity froze. Morgan took control. He pulled the key New York bankers into his library, locked the doors, and pushed them to use their own funds to stop the bleeding in the system. They agreed because they had no choice. The plan held. The panic faded, and Morgan ended up acting like a one-man central bank for America. But he was 70 and knew he couldn't repeat that kind of rescue. So Morgan and the top bankers in the country started working on something permanent. They needed a central bank, even though they understood most Americans hated the idea. The first and second banks of the United States had been shut down because regular people saw them as tools of elite control. So Morgan's circle hid their goal. In 1910, a small group that included Senator Nelson Aldrich and executives from the biggest banks met in secret on Jekyll Island, Georgia. They stayed there 9 days and built the blueprint that would turn into the Federal Reserve System. They kept everything quiet because they knew the reaction would be explosive if people realized bankers were designing the nation's entire monetary structure. Their plan relied on optics. The new institution wouldn't be called a central bank. The name Federal Reserve System sounded harmless. Instead of one big bank, there would be 12 regional banks. Instead of direct Wall Street control, there would be a board of governors chosen by the president. On paper, it looked open, balanced, almost democratic. In practice, the setup locked in banker power. The regional Federal Reserve banks were owned by member banks. Those same banks picked the boards of the regional feds. The regional feds picked who sat on the Federal Reserve Board. The government appointed a few people, but the real influence stayed with the bankers.
The biggest authority, the ability to create money and buy government bonds, sat with the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, which was run by the major Wall Street banks tied to Morgan. Congress passed the Federal Reserve Act in December 1913. Most lawmakers didn't grasp the structure they were approving. Once it passed, the debt cycle widened fast. The government no longer relied only on private banks. It could borrow from the Federal Reserve, which now had the power to create fresh money to purchase government bonds. That meant the demand for government debt had no real ceiling. And this was the real shift. Before the Federal Reserve existed, the government could borrow only as much as banks had available. After 1913, that limit disappeared. The Federal Reserve found a way to pump money into the system by buying government bonds. The process looked simple on paper. The government issued a bond, and the Fed picked it up using money it had just created. That fresh money went straight into government spending, while the bond itself ended up on the Fed's balance sheet. Nothing backed it except the expectation that taxpayers would keep covering the payments forever. This setup made endless borrowing possible. The Fed guaranteed there would always be someone ready to take new bonds, so demand never dried up. With that support, the government didn't have to slow down. It could roll old debt into new debt again and again, knowing the Fed would keep buying. And every interest payment moved from taxpayers to the private banks that sit behind the Federal Reserve System. Morgan didn't live to see how far this would go. He died in 1913, the same year the Federal Reserve was created, but the structure he helped shape is what allows today's $38 trillion in U.S. debt to exist at all.
Without the Fed acting as a permanent buyer, the government would have hit a wall long ago. Markets on their own wouldn't have supported borrowing at this scale. But with the Fed there as a safety net, the ceiling disappeared. Debt became something with no endpoint, something that could expand without limit. By the 1970s, the debt framework built by Patterson, Rothschild, and Morgan had gone worldwide. Developed nations borrowed nonstop, refinanced old loans, and kept up interest payments without pause. Developing nations tried to follow the same path, but their story wasn't the same. They borrowed heavily for roads, power grids, and other projects, yet many of them didn't have the revenue to cover what they owed. The trap they were caught in was starting to strain the system, and it might have snapped if Paul Volcker hadn't stepped in and locked it into place. Volcker served as Federal Reserve Chairman from 1979 to 1987, and he walked into a crisis. Inflation was above 10%. Confidence in the U.S. was slipping. Foreign governments were pulling away from the dollar because they didn't trust it anymore. Volcker needed to crush inflation fast, even if it meant pushing the country into a recession. In 1979, he took a dramatic step. He drove the federal funds rate from 11% to a staggering 20%, the highest number ever recorded in American history. Inflation collapsed under that pressure, but there was a side effect that hit the developing world like a hammer. During the 1970s, countries across Latin America had borrowed billions in U.S. dollars while interest rates were low. Once Volcker pushed rates up, those loans came due under completely different conditions. Interest costs exploded. Mexico was on the hook for $80 billion. Brazil owed $60 billion. Argentina $40 billion. None of them could keep up. Their interest payments were larger than the money they brought in from exports. In August 1982, Mexico finally said it couldn't pay, a flat-out default. That default should have started a chain reaction that broke the global financial system. American banks had provided most of those loans. If Mexico stopped paying, Citibank, Bank of America, Manhattan, and others would take huge hits. Some might have collapsed. The entire banking structure was in danger. Volcker could have stepped back and let the losses fall where they should have. He could have let the banks absorb the hit and allowed the market to reset itself. He didn't. Instead, he arranged a rescue through the International Monetary Fund. The IMF stepped in and lent Mexico, Brazil, Argentina, and other nations enough money to keep paying interest to American banks. These were called structural adjustment loans, and they weren't free. They came with strict terms. Those terms were harsh, and they reshaped entire economies.
Governments ended up slashing budgets, selling off state property, loosening protections, letting foreign investors walk in, devaluing their currencies, and giving up pieces of their own economic control, just to keep the interest payments moving. And the important part is simple. These IMF loans never actually lowered the total debt. They only pushed it forward, reshaped it, and locked it in so it stayed manageable but never disappeared. That was the core of Voller's idea. When a country reaches the point where the numbers no longer add up, you don't wipe the slate clean. You rearrange it. You lend just enough to keep the interest coming in, and you push governments to accept political and economic terms in return. The debt trap turned into a steady tool of leverage. States that couldn't meet their obligations had no choice but to open their markets, unload national assets, and follow outside economic rules just for the chance to stay in the system and keep owing money. This same setup has played out again and again for decades. Greece in 2010, Argentina in 2001, Sri Lanka in 2022. Different regions, different crises, but the same pattern each time. IMF loans arrive not to clear the books, but to keep interest payments alive. Austerity follows, sovereignty shrinks, and the debt remains, reshaped and stretched out so it never ends. Volcker passed away in 2019, but what he built still runs the show. His structure guarantees that the debt loop reaches every corner of the global system, and that no country is really allowed to walk away. Even when a nation reaches the point where repayment is impossible, default isn't the option. Instead, it gets refinanced into a long-term cycle where the debt becomes permanent, and the interest continues to flow to the same set of creditors. The old institutions and the old logic remain unchanged. The same banks, the same global actors, the same machine Patterson set in motion in 1694 still collects its due. Now, here's how the four architects locked in a world where debt stretches on without a finish line. Start with Patterson's basic structure. Governments borrow, they pay interest indefinitely, and the original amount never gets cleared. Bring in the Rothschild move. Turn that debt into something that can be traded everywhere, so the creditors are spread across the whole system. A default anywhere threatens the stability of the entire network. Add Morgan's layer. Central banks generate new money when needed and use it to buy government bonds, making sure demand never dries up. That means governments can borrow endlessly. Then add Volcker's loop. When a country hits the wall, restructure the debt, keep the interest stream alive, and avoid forgiveness at all costs. Put it all together and you get the world we're living in. Around $315 trillion in debt across governments, companies, and households. None of it on track to be repaid. All of it feeding interest to the financial structure that links everything. A default in one place shakes the entire system. Here's how it works in practice. The U.S. government has issued about $38 trillion in debt. Roughly $20 trillion of that is in the hands of Americans through pension funds, mutual funds, banks, insurance companies, and the Federal Reserve. These groups buy treasury bonds because they're treated as the safest assets available. But those bonds generate close to $1 trillion in interest every year. That money comes from taxes. So workers pay the government, and the government sends a large part of that money to the institutions holding the bonds. Most of those institutions are controlled by wealthy investors. It becomes a steady shift of income from labor to capital, year after year, with no end point.
The remaining $18 trillion is owed to government programs like the Social Security Trust Fund and the Medicare Trust Fund. The government borrowed from these funds and spent the money long ago, leaving the programs holding IOUs that depend on the same system of endless debt to stay afloat. Governments like to say the system balances itself, but in the end, taxpayers still pick up the bill. When Social Security needs to cash in its bonds, the government has to raise more money. That means higher taxes or new borrowing. It's a loop that looks neat on paper, but works like a shell game in practice.
The interest keeps piling up no matter what. Now picture the same setup on a global scale. Japan sits on about 9 trillion in debt, most of it owed to Japanese institutions and the Bank of Japan. Europe carries around 14 trillion, held mainly by European banks and the ECB. China runs its own stack of domestic debt through state banks. Different countries, same model. And they tie into each other. Japan holds U.S. treasuries. The U.S. backs European bonds through the IMF. Europe holds developing nation debt through the World Bank. Money circles around the planet. Everyone owes someone else, and the interest always ends up with the groups that hold and manage the debt. This is why the cycle can't stop. If the U.S. tried to pay off all 38 trillion, the money supply would implode. Dollars come into existence when the government borrows. If the debt vanished, a huge share of dollars would vanish too. That would spark deflation, then a depression, then a full-blown collapse. So the government doesn't have the option to clear the slate. It's locked into constant borrowing, constant refinancing, constant interest payments. The same logic applies everywhere. If all governments settled their debts, the global money supply would drop by roughly 2/3. Trade would jam. Banks wouldn't have enough liquidity to function. The whole system would stall. Debt isn't an accident. It's baked into the design, and the world runs on it. And the winners are clear. The institutions that hold the bonds profit the most. BlackRock, Vanguard, State Street, Fidelity. These firms handle tens of trillions. They buy government bonds using other
People's savings, pensions, retirement accounts, insurance money. Then they earn interest, roughly 1 trillion every year from U.S. debt alone, plus payments from Japan, Europe, and everywhere else. That stream of money moves from taxpayers straight to the bondholders. It's one of the biggest ongoing wealth transfers in history. Most people never notice because it isn't labeled as a tax. It's listed as debt service. But the effect is the same. Workers pay out, institutions collect, and the total debt never really shrinks. There's one more layer. The 4 architects behind this structure didn't plan it together. They lived in separate centuries, solving different problems, but each solution ended up helping the banking world. Patterson made debt permanent in 1694. Rothschild pushed it global in 1815. Morgan made it limitless in 1913. Volcker made it unavoidable in 1982. Piece by piece, they shaped a system where governments borrow endlessly and hand over interest forever. The groups that hold the bonds, manage the books, and sweep in the interest stand at the top. Not the governments, not the taxpayers, the financial institutions. And the final point is simple. That 38 trillion isn't a crisis for them. It's the foundation of their business. Every dollar of government debt shows up as an asset on someone's balance sheet. It earns interest, it backs more loans, it keeps the machine running. As long as people trust the system and assume the government will keep paying interest, the whole structure stays upright, even if the original debt is never paid back. That's how the trap closes. There's no real exit. Any attempt to break out would blow up the global financial setup. 4 architects, 3 centuries, and 1 design kept running. Now everyone on the planet sits inside it, whether they know it or not. If this shifted how you look at government debt, if you now see that the 38 trillion didn't show up by accident or through bad math, but came from a plan that's doing exactly what it was built to do, then
you're starting to get a clearer view of how power works in the real world. And if you want to keep digging into how this machine was put together and who keeps it running today, you can follow along, because none of this will show up in any classroom. Schools will tell you debt is something you're supposed to eliminate, a flaw that needs fixing. But the architects weren't confused. They didn't see debt as a mistake. They used it as the base layer. It was always meant to be the core that everything else rests on, the piece that holds the system in place, while everyone else looks the other way.